Uh, Welcome to part two, uh, POTOS 5 force model. Uh, so we are now moving from the macro environment to industry level analysis. So the question we are asking now is, why are some industries persistently profitable? Or while others are persistently unprofitable? And the answer, as Mike Porter argued so compellingly in 1979, lies largely in industry structure. So think about the difference between the commercial airline industry and the pharmaceutical industry. The airlines have been, over the long run, remarkably unprofitable. As Warren Buffett has famously quipped that the smartest thing anyone ever did for investors was kill the oh sorry Wright brothers before they invented the airplane. As collectively, the airlines have destroyed enormous amounts of shareholder value over the decades, punctuated by occasional booms when capacity is tight. In contrast, the pharmaceutical industry has generated extraordinarily high and sustained profitable for its major players. So companies like Pfizer, Roche, Novartis, and Johnson & Johnson J&J earn profit margins that would be the envy of almost any other sector. Why the difference? It's not primarily about the talent of people running these companies or even the operational efficiency of their processes. It is about the structure of the industries themselves. The airline industry has structural characteristics. So the specific characteristic is the high fixed cost and a commodity like a service in the eyes of most customer, and also intense library and a powerful labor union, and a constant flows of new entrants. That then make sustained profitability very difficult. But in contrast, pharmacy sector, they has structural characteristics. They have strong patent protection, high barriers to entry, limited buyer power for individual drugs, and differentiated products. So that enables sustained high profitability. So this is Porter's fundamental insights. So profitability is not randomly distributed across firms. It is systematically related to the structural characteristics of the industries in which those firms compete. Understanding those structural characteristics and how they affect the intensity of competition is therefore essential to strategy formulation. So Porter identified five structural forces that collectively determine the competitive intensity and, therefore, the profit potential of any industry. So these are the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of supplier, the bargaining power of buyer, the threats of substitute products or services, and the intensity of rivalry among existing competitors. So together, these five forces determine how the economic value created in an industry gets distributed and whether that value is retained by firms or competed away to customers, suppliers, and other stakeholders. Okay, so let's move to the five forces model deeply. Mm, the first one, search of new entrants. So the first of Porter's five forces is the search of new entrants. So this force asks how easy is it for a new competitor to enter this industry? So if the answer is very easy, the threat is high, which puts downward pressure on profits because incumbents must either cut prices or invest heavily to deter entry. So if the answer is very difficult, the threat is low. So which allows incumbents to sustain higher profits. So easy to answer is to enter. If yes, high threat, right? And if no, low threat. Okay, so the threat of new entrants is largely determined by the height of what economists call barriers. The factors that make it difficult or costly for a new competitor to establish a viable as a competitive position. Let us go through the major types of entry barriers. First is economies of scale. So in many industries, the cost per unit of production falls as the volume of production increases. So this happens because of fixed cost, factories, equipment, management overhead, R&D spending. The gets spread over more units. A new entrant typically starts small, so which means it faces a cost disadvantage relative to an established incumbent that is already producing at scale. So to compete effectively, the new entrant must either find a way to achieve scale quickly, so which requires large capital investment, or accept a cost disadvantage and try to compete in some other way. And second is capital requirement. Some industries simply require enormous amounts of capital to enter. So you cannot start an aircraft manufacturing company in your garage. Building a commercial aircraft requires billions of dollars of investment in design, engineering, testing, manufacturing facility, tooling, and supply chain development. The capital requirements of the industry act as a neutral filter, limiting entry to very large, well-capitalized organizations. So this protects incumbents like Airbus and Boeing. So thought not entirely, as we have seen from the challenges posed by companies like Brazil's Umbrella and China's COMAC. And third, product differentiation and brand identity. Mhm. Third one is product differentiation and brand identity. So if existing competitors have strong brands and customer loyalty, new entrants face an uphill battle convincing customers to switch. In consumer goods categories like soft drinks, luxury fashion, or athletic footwear like that, um, a good example is Coca-Cola, Louis Vuitton, maybe and Nike have built decades of consumer associations and preferences that are extraordinarily difficult for a new entrant to displace. So the challenger must invest heavily in marketing and brand building before it can expect to win significant market share. And first one is cost advantage is independent of scale. So sometimes incumbents have cost advantage that have nothing to do with size or scale. So they might have a proprietary technology protected by patent. So they might have looked up the best locations, as early fast food chains did when they secure prime roadside positions before competition intensified. So they might have favorable access to raw materials. A mining company sitting on a rich or deposit, or for example, they might have accumulated operational learning and expertise over decades that a new entrant would take years to replicate. Fifth, access to distribution channel. So in many industries, getting your product to the customer requires access to distribution networks that are limited or controlled by incumbents. A new beverage company, for example, faces the challenge of getting its products onto supermarket shelves that are heavily competed for. So major beverage companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, have invested for decades in distribution relationships, refrigeration equipment at point of sale, and a promotional contract with retailers. So displacing that distribution advantage is extremely difficult for a new entrant. Uh, there are quite a lot actually. The fifth one is access to distribution channel. And sixth one is government policy. So governments sometimes intentionally restrict entry into certain industries for reasons of safety, so economic development or national security. So you cannot just start an airline without obtaining an operating certificate from the aviation authority, and you cannot launch a new bank without a banking license. You cannot offer certain finance products without regulatory registration, and these regulatory requirements can range from relatively minor compliance costs to prohibitively expensive barriers. And also, seventh is the switching cost. So when customer face cost, I'm gonna write it. Costs. With S. Voila. So when customer face cost, financial, operational, psychological, or relational, is for switching from one supplier to another, so they become less likely to switch, which protect the incumbent supplier from competitive entry. So enterprise software is a classic example. So when a company has deeply integrated an ERP system like SAP, or Oracle, so into its core business processes. The cost of switching to a new system is enormous. Retaining employees, migrating data, rebuilding integrations, disrupting operations. This switching cost creates a moat that makes it very difficult for a new entrant to displace the incumbent. So even if the new entrant product is superior. Uh, and also, uh, eighth, is incumbency advantage beyond scale. Support also notes what might be called the first mover advantages. Benefits that occur to companies simply by virtue of being established players. So these include established customer relationships, favorable contracts, institutional knowledge, and the simple advantage of being a known and trusted supplier. A new entrant must overcome the inheritance of existing buying relationships. Finally, the threat of re- retaliation. retaliation. So even if a new entrant can theoretically overcome all the barriers we have discussed, so it must also factor in the likely response of existing competitors. If incumbents are known to retaliate aggressively against the new entrants by cutting price, increasing marketing spend, or flooding distribution channel, the deterrent effect can be substantial. The expectation of fierce retaliation can deter entry even before it happens. So when we bring all these factors together, so we can assess the overall height of entry varies in an industry and therefore the threat of new entrants. So high barriers equal low threat of new entrants, which is good for incumbent profitability. So low barriers equal high threats of new entrants, so which puts constant pressures on incumbent profitability. Okay, we move on to second force, the bargaining power of supplier. And you guys must remember the five forces. Okay, so switch of new entrants, bargaining power supplier, bargaining power buyer, switch of substitutes, rivalry among existing competitors. Okay, I hope you guys for it. Uh, the second force is the bargaining power of suppliers. So this asks how much power do the companies that supply input to our industry have over us. If suppliers are powerful, so they can raise prices, reduce quality, or reduce availability, all of which squeeze the profitability of firms in our industry. If suppliers have little power, so we can negotiate favorable terms and capture more of the value we create. So supplier power tends to be high under several conditions. So first, When the supplier industry is more concentrated than the buyer industry. Mhm. So if there are only three companies in the world that make a particular specialized components that your industry needs, those three suppliers have significant leverage. So conversely, if your industry has hundreds of firms buying from thousands of suppliers, each individual supplier has relatively little power. Okay, it's easy, right? And second, so when there are few substitutes for what the supplier provides, if there is no readily available alternative to the supplier's products, buyers have limited resources. If the supplier raises prices or reduces quality, a critical intellectual property, a patent molecule needed to produce a drug, for example, that gives its owner extraordinary the bargaining power over any manufacturer who needs that molecule. Third, when the buyer's business is not particularly important to the supplier. So if your purchases represent only a tiny fraction of a large supplier's revenue, the supplier has little incentive to offer you favorable terms. You are not important enough to them. So this is why large companies often enjoy significant purchasing advantages over small ones. So they represent a more valuable share of the supplier's business. And fourth, when the supplier product is highly differentiated or has high switching costs, if you have built your processes around a specific supplier's technology or product, switching to an alternative is costly. The supplier knows this and can use it as leverage. Oracle and SAP benefit enormously from the switching cost built into their enterprise software platforms. And fifth one, when the supplier could credibly integrate forward into your industries. If a powerful supplier has the capability and incentive to enter your business directly, to cut out the middleman and sell directly to your customers. This threat gives them additional negotiating leverage. Amazon's ability and willingness to introduce its own private label products, the PB products, in categories where it originally only sold third-party brands is a classic example of forward integration creating supplier leverage. The strategic response to high supplier power varies. The companies can try to develop alternative suppliers, reducing dependence on any single one. They can invest in integrating backward, acquiring or building supply capabilities internally. They can form purchasing consortia, so with industry peers to increase collective buying powers, or they can design their products to be compatible with a wider range of input sources, reducing switching costs. Good. I hope everyone understands the second factor. Mm, okay. We move on to third force, bargaining power of buyer. The customers who purchase your product or services, um, which means that the third force is the bargaining power buyer. The powerful buyer can demand lower prices, higher quality, more services, or better terms, all of which squeeze your margin. So weak buyer have less ability to make these demands, allowing you to capture more value. So buyer power tends to be on high under analogous conditions to supplier powers, but in reverse. So first, when the buying industry is more concentrated than the selling industry, so if you are a small supplier selling to a small number of very large customers, those customers have enormous leverage. Think about a small components manufacturer selling to Walmart or Toyota. So these giant buyers account for a huge fraction of the supplier's revenue and can credibly threaten to switch suppliers or develop alternatives. The supplier is in a weak position. A second, when the buyer's purchases represent a large portion of your revenues, concentration and volume create leverage. The more important a buyer is to you, the more power they have over you. So third, when the products or services you sell are undifferentiated or standardized, so for example, commodities, so if the buyer can easily switch from you to competitors without meaningful quality or performance difference, so you have little protection from price pressure. Sorry. So commodity markets, basic chemicals, bulk agricultural products, generic drugs, exhibit extremely high buyer power for this reason. And the first one, when switching costs for the buyer are low, if a buyer can switch supplier with little effort, pain, or expense, they will not hesitate to threaten to do so in order to extract better prices. So low switching costs are the enemy of price power. The fifth, when the buyer is fully informed about the prices and alternatives, information asymmetry can protect sellers. If buyers do not know what your competitor charges, they have difficulty pressing for lower prices. But in markets with full price transparency, like commodity exchanges, consumer electronics retail, the online marketplace, the buyer can easily benchmark prices and demand that you match competitor. So the internet has dramatically increased the price transparency across a huge range of markets, generally increasing buyer power. So there are several reasons, but internet changed a lot, right? The sixth one is when the buyer could credibly integrate backward, for example, produce the product themselves. Large companies that could, in principle, to bring production in-house are more powerful buyers because the threat of insourcing gives them additional negotiating leverage. Seventh, when the buyer is fully informed about the prices and alternatives, information asymmetry can protect sellers. If buyers do not know what your competitors charge, they have difficulty pressing for lower prices. But in markets with full price transparency, so commodity exchanges, consumer electronics retail, online marketplaces, buyers can easily benchmark prices and demand that you match competitors. So the internet has dramatically increased the price transparency across a huge range of markets, so generally increasing buyer power. It is also worth distinguish between consumer buyers and business buyers as their power dynamics can differ significantly. So individual consumers are typically less powerful buyers than large businesses because their individual purchase volumes are small. Their ability to negotiate is limited, and they often lack perfect information. But in aggregate, shifting consumer preferences, expressed through the purchasing decisions and increasingly through social media and review platforms, can exert substantial collective pressure on companies. So entire industries have had to change their practices from plastic straw to palm oil sourcing in response to consumer pressure exercised through the marketplace rather than through the individual negotiation. So business to business B2B buyer can be extremely powerful. So when they are large and concentrated, but they also can be locked in by technical specification, establish the supply relationships, and the complexity of switching enterprise-grade products or services. The strategic challenge for B2B suppliers is to simultaneously manage the power dynamics of large accounts while building differentiation. So switching costs and relationship depths that reduce the leverage those accounts have. So strategically, firms with high buyer power in their industry they try to reduce it by differentiating their products, increasing switching costs, diversifying their customer base to reduce the dependence on any single buyers, or moving up the value chain to where buyer power is lower. Good. Mm, you're almost done. Now, the first force is the switch of substitute product or services. So we just call the substitute. So a substitute is a product from a different industry that fulfills the same underlying needs as your product. So notice that this is different from competitor within your industry. A substitute comes from outside. The classic example is the taxi industry versus ride-hailing services. A good example is a taxi versus what Uber like that. Maybe a Lyft. Tax companies compete primarily against other tax companies, but then came a substitute, a technology-enabled platform that fulfilled the same underlying need, getting from point A to point B through the fundamentally different model. The taxi industry did not initially recognize this as a threat from a substitute because it was coming from outside the traditional industry boundary. So by the time they understood the threat, significant disruption had already occurred. The substitutes are a threat when they offer a favorable price-performance trade-off relative to the industry's products. So if a substitute delivers similar values at a lower price or significantly greater value at a similar price, the customers will be tempted to switch. The greater the value proposition of the substitute, the stronger its threat. The substitutes are also more threatening when buyers' switching costs are low. If it is easy for a customer to switch from your product to the substitute, no long-term contract, no technical compatibility issues, no retaining required, the threat is higher, right? So let us think about a few more examples. The video rental industries, Blockbusters being a famous casualty, so was devastated by the substitute of streaming video. The underlying need was entertainment at home. DVD rentals satisfied that need is one way. The streaming satisfied it in a different way, but with significant advantages in convenience and selection, right? Um, Personally, I also prefer to watch the movie and some interesting some videos on my lovely couch sofa. Yes. Anyway, so substitutes occurred rapidly and fatally. So the newspaper industry has faced substitution from distant news sources, social media, and online information platforms. The underlying need, staying informed about the current events, is well served by digital media, often at your marginal cost. The substitute essentially competed on price in a way that the newspaper's traditional business model couldn't match because newspapers' business model was heavily dependent on the print advertising that also migrated to digital. A subtler example, the threat of teleconference and video call technology as a substitute for business travel. For many years, the airline and hotel industries argued that business travel was irreplaceable because face-to-face interaction was qualitatively different from virtual interaction. So they were largely correct, and business travel remained robust. But the COVID-19 pandemic forced a massive involuntary experiment in virtual interaction, and the result has been a lasting reduction in some categories of business travel, particularly short domestic trips for single day meetings. The substitute proved more powerful than incumbents had acknowledged. Okay, so when analyzing substitute threats, you must ask what are the underlying needs that our product satisfies, and what other products or technologies could satisfy those same needs, even if differently, and what are the price performance characteristics of potential substitutes, and how are they trending like that. Okay. Um. Okay. Good. Maybe it's better to stop here. We take a break, then we back to the last fifth first rivalry among existing competitors. Okay, let's take a break.